In Brussels, we brought together a group of stakeholders representing NGOs, protected area authorities, environmental organizations working at pan-European level, and also EU delegates to do a reality check of the outputs that we have produced so far. By bringing together the academia and practitioners, we are able to create bridges. In one hand, we had the chance to harvest their knowledge and their experience, and at the same time, we had the opportunity to check the outputs of the NaturaConnect, being connectivity model analysis, being priorities for protected area expansion, being socioeconomic benefits that we need to work together. With this event, we are able also to understand what can we do to increase the uptake of the outcomes of the project, and how can we empower these participants to use these tools and mainstream them in their local networks, national networks, or European networks.
It is true that it will be a real challenge to put this into practice because so far a lot of protected areas in Europe are not designed in a very systematic way. Of course, we have the Natura 2000 network, which is based on a scientific approach. It has some strengths in that respect that we don't see in the nationally designated areas. But of course, Natura 2000 is only for those species and habitats listed in the directives. We see that there is perhaps areas that should be also added because of a high level of endemicity for species that are not currently legally protected. There might be a lot of other reasons. Think about the climate adaptation and mitigation objectives, urban biodiversity, pollinators. There's a lot of reasons why there would be a need for further protected areas. And of course, we have the objective of strictly protecting 10%. This is currently far from being achieved, so we really need to work also on strict protection. But it's really ultimately to convince the member states that they use the scientific information to expand their protected area network if necessary. A lot of species have been recovered over the last 30, 40 years. And actually, we also see an increase still ongoing in terms of protected area coverage. A lot of this is currently going under the radar. We are currently also in the stage with a member state and the European Environment Agency to review the reporting of protected areas. And I think for the first time in 2026, we will have information on strictly protected areas reported in a coherent way. And then we'll see how much we have progressed in the last years, because a lot of this information is currently not public.
What NaturaConnect can help the countries do is to identify what areas they can protect additional to the current areas that are protected to meet these 30% targets. It will bring the maximum benefit in terms of coverage of biodiversity, in terms of species and habitats in the Habitats Directive. So there is a big difference in, let's say, increasing 5% of your coverage and protecting an additional 10 species, or increasing 5% of the coverage and protecting an additional 100 species.
80% of the protected areas in Europe are less than 10 kilometers squares in size. So that means that different protected areas need to be connected in order to be able to favor and allow the populations to persist, individuals' movements, flow of genes across the areas, and so on. And even more, if we look at the future, we know that climate change is going to change the range of species. So species need to move beyond the current borders of protected areas. So this is why we need connections between all those areas in order to ensure that they are able to move to the sites that will be good for them.
I think one of the biggest barriers to connectivity planning and assessment is the multiple stakeholder groups that have to be involved at several different scales, and then also the evidence they need to communicate to policymakers to allow for those connectivity plans to be put into place. And so I think that's one of the biggest benefits of the NaturaConnect is the data that we're producing, as well as the tools and different communication devices we're using to get that message across. And I think that will be a really long-lasting legacy of NaturaConnect.
We are trying to reverse this old paradigm of is either biodiversity or is it human livelihoods. And that's why this project matters, because we are finding ways in which actually people can benefit from nature conservation through ecosystem services such as soil erosion control, through cultural services such as tourism value and people attachment to charismatic species and environment. And so I think why this matters is that we are trying to provide positive stories and ways for people to think about biodiversity conservation in a different way. It's not as a zero-sum game, it's either this or that, but actually both together.
The systematic mapping that NaturaConnect does can really boost environmental benefits. For example, by overlaying the nature priority data with information on things like carbon sinks, water quality, landscape risk, flood risk. And it's also a way of really getting a lot more commitment and motivation from people, because they can see tangible benefits that they might not identify with if it's just focused on the nature interests. And if governments can see that they're achieving two goals on one piece of land, for example, by protecting their carbon alongside meeting their biodiversity targets, then they'll be a lot more willing to accept new protected areas and land protection.
Species and habitats are facing severe threats across Europe, across the world. And we have a key opportunity here with the international targets to meet 30% of protected area coverage and a third under strict protection, to halt the declines in species and habitats and to prevent further threats to species and habitats. There's two paths in which we can reach these targets. One path is countries try to somehow reach these targets in the easy areas, but not necessarily those that actually matter most for biodiversity. And that approach actually risks missing a lot of key areas that would halt actually biodiversity decline and that would protect key irreplaceable sites. The other path, which we're taking in this project, is actually finding the best areas to protect based on what we know of where species and habitats are across Europe, where they will be under future climate change, and how to connect these different protected areas for species movements. And so that really allows us to understand where irreplaceable sites are and where are we going to be able to reduce gaps in coverage for species and habitats that are underprotected. And in order to do that, you really need to look beyond country borders, because you can only understand how unique and irreplaceable a site is if you have this broader, bigger picture. And people in different countries value nature quite differently. So, for example, species like the beaver, the wolf, the bear, the lynx, or birds of prey can be perceived and valued quite differently. We try to account for different values and different values of nature in this project by creating alternative scenarios that reflect these different values of nature.
This project is one of the first really accounting for how land use is changing in the future. So we're not planning a protected area network for today, we're planning it to be resilient for the conditions of the future. So we accounted for scenario simulations of how land use pressures are changing in time in the prioritization of areas to be protected. So that's a real novelty of this project. There's a lot of negatives on biodiversity, and it's hard to see degradation of biodiversity happening almost everywhere around Europe. And pressures will only increase with climate change and diseases and a lot of other human pressures. At the same time, we also know, and that gives me the hope, that if we want, we can restore biodiversity pretty fast. By the right investments, the right actions, we can make it happen, and nature will recover.